When critics talk of the failures of federally funded high-rise housing projects, they often cite the example of the huge Pruitt-Igoe project in St. Louis.
Pruitt-Igoe became not just the national and even the world symbol for the failure of American public housing. It's also been a symbol for the perceived failure of well-intentioned government policies in general. Here we turn to the government to solve this issue, to accommodate all the people who needed new housing, and government failed.
It was touted as the solution, a cure for the disease. Pruitt-Igoe would rise above the polluted slums, lifting its residents out of poverty. They would thrive, and the city would prosper. Everything would be different.
Well, it was a very beautiful place, like a big hotel resort, I'd say, with plenty of green grass, trees, shrubbery, and all the works.
What happened?
Well, one day we woke up and it was all gone.
In the middle 50s, St. Louis thought it had solved its low-cost housing needs, but instead a monster was created.
But things changed quickly. As problems mounted, the decline was steep. Those who could move out did.
12,000 people were originally jammed into these 33 buildings. Only 2,500 people still linger in the remaining shells.
It became poor, increasingly segregated, heavily vandalized, and began to resemble the slums it replaced.
Pruitt-Igoe looks like a battleground. Vandalism and neglect have left fear among the remaining occupants.
Crime rates rose. Fear grew. Conditions worsened. Outsiders stayed away. It had become notorious.
Some projects became breeding grounds for crime. The Pruitt-Igoe project in St. Louis is a casebook example.
In St. Louis, Missouri today, the health of an ailing neighborhood got some long and badly needed treatment.
So in St. Louis today, they were hard at work again, this time tearing down what was built before.
2 decades after opening Pruitt-Igoe, the government gave up.
And because they are so desperate, they are willing to try desperate things.
It was a powerful story, with a dramatic end. The footage was replayed again and again. Long after the dust settled and the site was cleared, this is the Pruitt-Igoe that remained. The mythical Pruitt-Igoe with a fatal flaw, doomed to failure from the start. Some blamed the welfare state. Others attacked the architect.
Production of an environment of fear.
Many stated flatly that the residents caused their own problems and had taken Pruitt-Igoe with them.
Social as well as economic failure.
Little was said about the laws that built and maintained it, the economy that deserted it, the segregation that stripped away opportunity, the radically changing city in which it stood. It's a powerful story with a dramatic end, and its aftershocks are still with us.
In the years after the war, they came by the thousands. Small farmers who couldn't make it on 40 acres. Tenants who saw a chance for their children up north. They brought them in the hope that in the center of so much wealth, there would be a place for them.
Mechanized labor had changed agriculture in the South. Tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and field workers could no longer scratch out a living. The new migrants arrived with little money or property. They were shepherded into the only place in which they were welcome. Distressed neighborhoods near inner-city jobs known as the slums.
You really had these people called slumlords who took advantage of the fact that the poor basically had to live in the center of cities close to where their jobs were. You had acres and acres of housing that was unsafe and unsanitary. And the slumlords knew that they could just jam as many people as possible into it. So it was a very profitable system, but it was also completely destructive, not just for the people who were stuck in the slums, but for the whole urban community.
The door was open for a public option. Housing reformers pressed lawmakers to replace the slums with clean, modern housing, to re-energize the Depression-era housing program that had been stalled by the war. They found an unlikely ally in civic leaders and politicians who began to see the ring of slums as an eyesore that blighted the aging downtown area.
The downtown interest just wanted the slums to go away. They didn't particularly care what happened to the people, but because they were wealthy and powerful, they were a very important part of the coalition that passed the 1949 Housing Act. The federal government would put up the money to buy slum property using eminent domain if necessary, to condemn not just individual houses but whole blocks and whole sets of blocks, to knock them down and to rebuild on a modern and humane scale. The essence of public housing was that the public sector could do a better job. People who had been living where they literally never saw the sun, now they would have more magnificent views than the richest people in St. Louis. It enabled the most disadvantaged people in our cities to be liberated from the slums.
Just to the north and west of downtown St. Louis, construction began on a newly cleared 57-acre site in 1952. The Wendell Pruitt and William Igoe homes became a proud symbol of St. Louis's rebirth. A modern break with the crumbling past that surrounded it.
My family came from a very small house, and I would say it was like a shack, actually. There were 3 rooms, and there were 12 in my family. The sleeping conditions were quite crowded. My mom slept in the kitchen, if you can believe that. She had a roll-away bed in the kitchen next to the pot-belly stove.
Some friends came by and said they got a new project up here. We're going to put an application. You want to come? It was the first building they opened up in Pruitt. It was like an oasis in the desert. All this newness. I'd be the first person to occupy my unit. That was a thrill for me. And then they put me on the 11th floor, where I was. You didn't live any higher than the 2nd floor. And they would put me on the 11th floor with elevators. But once I moved in on the 11th floor with elevators, I called it poor man's penthouse. I didn't want to live on another floor. I never thought I would live in that kind of a surrounding.
When we first moved in, it was probably one of the most exciting things of my life. It was like another world. Everybody had a bed. My mom had her own bed, and I was so happy to see her just in a room to herself with a door.
Almost from day one, these buildings were under-maintained. There was never an adequate provision for the maintenance that was so important to these very complex structures. Government paid for building them, but the maintenance had to come out of money from the rents of the tenants. This country is not, in general, very good to poor people. And a cause that's only a poor people's cause generally doesn't get very far.
And so the law was written and the slums were cleared. The towers built and valuable land redeveloped, all with federal funding. But with no federal funds for operation and maintenance, the projects became dependent on their tenants' income. In the beginning, low and middle income applicants flooded into Pruitt-Igoe's new apartments. Rental incomes were strong. Grounds were maintained, elevators worked, security staff patrolled the area. It thrived in the crowded city. But the city was changing.
One of the big questions for planners and policymakers and politicians during and after World War II was, what would the future of St. Louis look like in terms of its population? They really wanted to believe that the growth trajectory was actually going to be upward after World War II, so that there would be about 1 million people by 1970. And if you were going to fit 1 million people into the city, then you had to have some kind of large-scale housing. The problem is, though, that there are two trends going on at once. One of the trends is upward growth, and the other trend is large numbers of people who have enough means leaving the city. And planners mistook which one was the dominant trend.
St. Louis's population peaked in the 1950s. The growth that had defined the war years had ended. Yet well out of earshot of downtown gridlock and demolition, a new kind of city was being developed on a massive scale. But it was not the urban high-rise envisioned by city planners. Instead, the new American dream was built on cheap lots on the margins of cities, and one-story ranches that came to dominate the landscape of the suburbs.
2/3 of the people in our country now live in a metropolitan area. Mostly the growth is out here in the suburbs. There are many good things about living in this new world. It has given millions of families pleasant, well-planned homes, a place to have a garden with light and air and space.
What people didn't see in 1949 was that the cities were emptying out. They were losing their middle class. They were losing their industrial base. With the loss of population and jobs, you had a loss of tax base, and you enter into this vicious circle where within the cities there was a deterioration of basic services. Whereas in the suburbs, every single year there was a growth in the value of your house, more services, more jobs that were close to where you were living, better schools. The federal government basically committed itself to making the suburbs affordable for the American middle class and for the white working class. Essentially, we had a national pro-suburban policy during the years when Pruitt-Igoe was being built.
As poor migrants from the South continued to flood in, the middle-class exodus was nearly complete. For St. Louis, post-war urban decline was especially quick and hard. Its toughest years were ahead. By 1980, the city of St. Louis would lose half its mid-century population. The planners had expected an overcrowded city of 1 million people. They built massive projects like Pruitt-Igoe, expecting them to fill. But the plans were collapsing. St. Louis was in free fall.
Though it's only a crossroads on the highway north of St. Louis, you can hardly miss Blackjack as you pass through it.
65 feet in subdivisions developed under the density...
Tiny Blackjack incorporated itself as a city last August and promptly passed a zoning law prohibiting the construction of new apartment buildings, among them a proposed low to middle income housing project. The citizens of Blackjack fear that a project in their neighborhood might become a suburban Pruitt-Igoe, destroying their property values and their safety.
The people who are out here are middle income, behave like middle income. They worry about their schools, they worry about their lawns, their property, and so forth.
They're going to bring in, shall we say, trash people? What kind of people?
Well, people, they're not necessarily just poor, but they're just, well, you won't be able to walk in the neighborhood then. I said it'd be people like that.
Christmas was like no other place because there was so many other kids around to play with and show off your stuff. I remember when my mother gave me a record player, and she couldn't afford to buy me a brand new one, so she went to the pawn shop and she got me a record player from the pawn shop. And baby, she left. We pulled the record player to the door, went outside, turned the record player up as high as it would go, and then people just came from everywhere. It was a party always in the evening. It didn't have to be any special day. Somebody somewhere had their music blasting.
My relationship with Pruitt-Igoe was that of a research assistant. I was working on a National Institute of Mental Health funded study on social problems in public housing. My role was to study women and girls in Pruitt-Igoe. I was 20 years old. I had just gotten out of college. Some of the girls were 18 years old, and I was 2 years older, but yet my life was vastly different. The strong, tightly knit communities and families in which I grew up had begun to shatter around the people who were displaced in a northern city with few supports. And the policy and the housing authority was to move the poorest of the poor, the most dependent families, to Pruitt-Igoe.
Before we moved in,
public housing in St. Louis was always used as a segregation tool. The city did everything in its power in order to prevent what was called Negro deconcentration, that is, African Americans moving out of particular neighborhoods. Every project is imagined as a white or black project solely, and they're actually placed on the map in St. Louis in ways that deepen the pockets of segregation in one place or the other. It's a way to really radically separate whites from blacks in ways that no other kind of legislation or other tool had ever been able to do.
The color line wound through a fractured city, cementing the widespread prejudice that inhabited backyards, boardrooms, and the halls of government. It was reflected in neighborhood property values, in the terms of mortgages, in the way realtors steered prospective buyers, and countless other tactics that preserved the racial barrier. Poor districts on desirable urban land were cleared for redevelopment, but were rarely replaced with affordable housing. These neighborhoods were disproportionately black. Residents were scattered to segregated pockets throughout the city. New ghettos formed as the old were demolished. Urban renewal found a new name: Negro removal. In the segregated city, blacks paid more for worse housing with fewer amenities. Older hospitals, higher food prices, less police protection. The city was changing. The northern black ghetto had arrived.
The urban economy in 1949 appeared very strong. Not only were the population of big cities peaking, but also their industrial production. What nobody could see was that this was the peak period, and that the urban industrial economy was about to really fall off a cliff. The American city has been, in the past, a wonderful mechanism for assimilation of immigrant and migrant groups, because it was essentially on an upward trend. What happened after 1945 was that that wonderful mechanism of opportunity began to fail. This economy still flourished, but it flourished outside the city. And as a result, you had a mismatch between where the jobs were and where the people who needed the jobs were living or forced to live. In the days of, say, the Italian and Jewish ghettos, these ghettos were close to those critical entry-level industrial jobs. The black ghetto, for the first time, was very far from where jobs were moving. They moved to the city, as the black migrants did, instead of finding themselves in the midst of this wonderful expanding urban economy, they found themselves in the midst of an economy that was dying.
Have you had any chance to work which you've turned down since you came to St. Louis?
No, sir, I haven't turned down any jobs.
What would you take? Would you take any job?
At the time I would.
You have people to support, family?
Wife and 2 children.
Do you think somehow you're going to get some work soon?
I don't know.
After I moved away from Pruitt-Igoe, I went on to become a police officer with St. Louis City. And I had the opportunity to work where you are in these buildings straight up and down. I do remember people calling the police and trying to come into the buildings, and they would drop just anything they could find, trash, throw trash out the window. I remember that. I remember them throwing firebombs out onto the police cars. I remember they did that. So there is enough blame to go around.
I don't think people rationalize that somebody's house could burn down or people could be killed. That was a way of making a statement. We're not happy here, and we want you to know it. No matter who it's saving, no matter how relevant or important it is, we want you to understand that you're not welcome here. And so, after a while, they just stopped showing up.
By the mid-60s, Pruitt-Igoe was falling apart. Runaway maintenance costs, rising vandalism and crime, growing numbers of vacancies, and an increasingly poor and emptying city.
Public housing was set up as a system that depended on an overcrowding crisis. Once populations begin to move out of the city, that begins to increase the vacancy rates in the rental markets. And so people begin to look elsewhere besides public housing for places to live. So Pruitt-Igoe had very little money to actually pay for maintenance and upkeep because it couldn't raise the money from the rents of the tenants because so many of them had left.
Grants were given to rehab buildings, studies were commissioned, but nothing seemed to help. The housing authority was faltering. The giant project's finances were bringing it down. Rents were raised. By the end of the decade, rents increased 3 times in 1 year. The residents were stretched. Some paid 3/4 of their income to live in Pruitt-Igoe.
Many times, you don't even know that you're sitting on a keg of dynamite.
Dogs, cats, or rats that you can just take us and just put us just anywhere. We want some decent place where we can live.
Toilets not being fixed on time. Windows that are never replaced, you understand? And the project just went down, and if your house was broken into, and you call the police and they wouldn't come because you were in Pruitt-Igoe.
And you mean to tell me they are doing their job? They are evading what is reality. And the fact is that Pruitt-Igoe is still standing there, and those policemen are afraid to go in there, and they don't give a damn.
In February 1969, St. Louis public housing residents began a rent strike, the first of its kind in the history of public housing. Tenant organizations collected the rent, which was withheld from the housing authority until demands were met.
Mr. Porter, the Housing Authority argues that since the project is run with rent money, you're only doing yourself a disservice by withholding the rent money. The conditions would be even worse.
Well, by withholding our money, we feel that that's our only stick that we feel as poor people that we have to fight with.
Well, the Housing Authority says it simply does not have the money. Where's it going to get the money to do what you want done?
We feel that's their problem.
So, handbills were passed out. Meetings were held. Senior citizens, handicapped people, young people walking the streets and don't pay the rent.
Well, we're going to keep rent striking until they do something, because we know that somebody can do something. They're saying that they're bankrupt. We are too. They're saying they can't do anymore. We can't either. The tenants don't have any money. They cannot pay this kind of rent and eat too. So I'm telling the people to eat and damn the rent.
You got people registering to vote and voting. You got people speaking up for their rights who never spoke up before. And you got people who seem to be able to do something about it. I'll put it that way. It caught on fire. And while we weren't praised for it, it occurred.
After 9 months of negotiations, the depleted housing authority finally gave in to the strikers' demands. Rents were limited to 1/4 of any tenant's income, and residents would have a much greater voice in the operation of St. Louis public housing. The victory was short-lived, as years of neglect placed beleaguered buildings on the verge of physical collapse. Just 2 months after the end of the rent strike, the dam finally broke.
When the temperatures dropped below freezing earlier this week, water lines in several of the Pruitt-Igoe apartment buildings broke and the subsequent flow of water turned into ice. At 2311 Dixon, a sewer line is broken, and now raw sewage bubbles out of the ground like a malevolent spring. In the building itself, residents and maintenance crews are working to clean up the mess.
Some of my friends had to come and help me sweep the water out the house.
What about heat? Have you got heat today?
No, we haven't had no heat in a week.
And you're using the gas stove for heat then?
Outside one of the buildings, in the mud, the slush, and the debris, we found this button which looks a bit the worse for wear. It says, "Make Pruitt-Igoe number 1. That undoubtedly reflects the feeling of many of the residents who live here, who suffered through broken pipelines in the sub-zero temperatures. Make Pruitt-Igoe number 1. Pruitt-Igoe at this point, and the other public housing units in St. Louis, are still a long way from number 1.
When they started to close that complex down, it became a really big hazard. The drug addicts and users and dealers started to move into the empty buildings, and now they got a big, giant, empty building to themselves because nobody lives in there. If you're on top of this building, if you stand on the 10th floor or any high-up apartment, you could look down, you could tell when the police were coming in. So there was no way, none, that they could sneak in there and get you.
There were drug havens set up in these empty buildings because they weren't monitored. Nobody checked them. So you had drug dealers who go in and set up a whole empire in an empty building. It was just too big, too unmonitored, and it was just uncontrollable.
We were standing underneath the building, and my brother was upset. So me and my mom, my stepdad, we stayed on the 4th floor, and we went upstairs, and he went on somewhere. And we weren't there 5 minutes, and we heard a bunch of shots.
I would wake up in the morning, and we'd go to school, and I remember one day walking by this yellow police tape or bloodstains on the concrete, and we were on our way to school. So you heard about these gangs and these drugs and this mysterious thing called heroin. And so these different words are coming into my life that I did not understand, but I knew that there was an element of danger that was associated with all this stuff.
I see people flinch all the time from backfires, from automobiles or whatever. But in the projects, you learn after a while that you don't flinch, you just look around and survey your environment. And within about 2 minutes, it's a rap at the door, boom, boom, boom. And it's this guy Herb, he's a friend of my brother. My brother's name was Beanie, his nickname was that. They just shot Beanie.
The nights I can remember walking through Pruitt-Igoe where it was snow on the ground and it was white and the moon was shining and then all these lights is on. Okay, so that means these places are occupied, there's life here. But when these buildings are abandoned, you don't know what's going on in there. You don't know who is in there or what they have on their mind if there is somebody in there. Nobody will hear me scream. So when you look at that and you think about it, it's time to go. I mean, everybody with a brain in their head knows when the party's over. And the party was over.
In 1972, 3 buildings of Pruitt-Igoe were imploded with dynamite, the first of which was nationally televised. 2 years later, the St. Louis Housing Authority received federal approval to close and completely demolish the Wendell Pruitt and William Igoe homes. By 1976, the site was cleared, its residents scattered across an emptying city. 57 acres of the North Side neighborhood again stood vacant, as it had less than 3 decades earlier in an overcrowded city with twice the population.
I remember seeing on the evening news Pruitt-Igoe being blown up. The immediate question that came to my mind was, whatever happened to all the people who lived there? And I think that the powers that be, the authorities in the city, strongly stigmatized the people who lived in Pruitt-Igoe. They gave the impression that it had imploded within before the explosion of the brick and mortar. It never made sense to label them the perpetrators and to use them as scapegoats as though they were the cause of structured inequality. It only makes sense if it's placed within this broader national context of what was happening to the urban poor. And it wasn't pretty.
The implosion footage was so shocking just because there was still in people's minds the idea that this had been the solution. It was a very painful moment of truth to see that failure. And that's why I think it's so important to look beyond those famous pictures of the towers being destroyed and really try to understand what failed and why. In some ways, Pruitt-Igoe failed because housing alone couldn't deal with the most basic issues that were troubling the American city. There was just no way to build your way out of that tragedy.
Public housing actually has a very fine grain to the story. It's not a total failure or a total success. The bigger story is, in fact, the decline of the city overall. What happened to St. Louis was tragic. It's kind of a slow-motion Katrina in a way. St. Louis lost half its population and had a devastated tax base and a drained economy over the course of 50 years from World War II even to the present. It's no wonder Pruitt-Igoe declined in those circumstances. I mean, it'd be hard to imagine a public housing project surviving under those conditions.